Tror jeg du kan starte, ja, Marte.
Okay. Okay, welcome to today's webinar, where we will explore and discuss pathways toward more nature-positive spatial planning, with a closer look at developments in Norway and England. Today's webinar is part of a series organized by the research network CIENS. CIENS is a partnership between leading environmental and social science research institutes here in Norway. My name is Marte Inseth. I'm a researcher and a political scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research here at Oslo Metropolitan University, Oslo Met. I will be the host of the webinar, and I will have the pleasure to introduce our excellent researchers who will contribute with presentations later on. I will return to them shortly. After each presentation, we will hopefully have time for a couple of questions from the audience. You may either write your question in the comments field and I can read it for you, or you can raise your digital hand asking to speak directly after the presentation. I will serve as a moderator, and should we run short of time straight after presentations, we have more time for discussions at the end of the webinar. Today, our point of departure is the ongoing loss and degradation of nature that is taking place across Europe. The UN's climate and biodiversity panels have long warned that land use change is one of the most significant drivers of the nature and climate crisis that we are now witnessing. An investigation conducted by the Norwegian broadcaster NRK in collaboration with researcher Zander Venter at NINA, the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, documents how Europe is moving in the wrong direction. Between January 2018 and December 2023, Europe lost approximately 9,000 square kilometers nature and fertile soil owing to land use changes. This is an area about the size as Cyprus, and it is also contrary to public objectives. As you can see, the mapping shows that Norway is the European champion in converting nature to development when measured in area per capita. Why this high land consumption in Norway? Well, obviously, Norway has a lot of land. Norway also has one of the most decentralized systems for land use planning in Europe, with 357 municipalities holding significant decision-making authority on land use planning and management within their territories. Soon, today, political scientist Christian Tvedt will present from a study of what explains this over-budgeting within their territories. Departing from the 2,100 kilometers that our municipalities have designated for future development in their municipal plans, Tvedt will soon talk about explanatory factors at municipal level. Having studied political drivers, capacity drivers and drivers in terms of municipal needs, he will explain the 2,166 square kilometers that are now adopted as a planned area for future development in current municipal plans. Besides a decentralized system with 357 municipalities as the primary planning authorities, an additional challenge for sustainable spatial planning is that Norwegian government lacks central oversight of the ongoing accumulated land take and nature development. The Norwegian planning system also deploys rather weak coordination mechanisms. So in short, although Norway has fairly decent biodiversity goals on paper, the implementation mechanisms are soft and the governance system is weakly coordinated. Ska vi se. One country that is now making efforts to hit the brakes and ensure that municipalities and other decision makers can move in the same direction is England. In 2000, and here is England. In 2004, a biodiversity net gain (BNG) system was made mandatory under the Town and Country Planning Act. Later today, we will hear from Nature Finance lead researcher at the Nature Positive Hub of Oxford University, Sophus through Gassen, who will discuss the current functioning of the newly adopted BNG system. Here, I will briefly point out some key points. So the basic purpose of the biodiversity net gain system is to ensure that land use and conversion of nature delivers an overall positive impact, a net gain on biodiversity. This means that developers are legally required to deliver a minimum of 10% biodiversity increase, net gain, when undertaking development projects in the form of more or better quality natural areas after development than before. So the net gain system is actually intended to enhance natural habitats. To get there, England has operationalized a statutory biodiversity metric as a joint quantitative governance tool. It takes information about habitat type, quality, size, and converts it into standardized biodiversity units. These units act as a common currency that tells planners and developers how much biodiversity will be lost and how much can be created to achieve net gain. So every project begins by quantifying existing biodiversity by means of this standardized biodiversity metric. It enables planners and developers to estimate how much biodiversity exists on the site, the baseline units, and how much would be lost through the development. A second baseline is the mitigation hierarchy. This means that developers must seek to avoid converting a new area, first of all. If that can't be done, then minimize the damages to nature. And finally, restore ecological impacts on sites. This is supposed to ensure that compensation is a last resort. Primarily, ecological measures should be implemented within the boundaries of the construction project itself. But if on-site restoration cannot achieve the required gains, off-site measures nearby can be permitted. As a last resort, developers may pay the state to undertake ecological restoration on their behalf by purchasing so-called national biodiversity credits. This creates regulated biodiversity markets, habitat banks credits, and national credits are sold exclusively by the government. So at the end, each project must demonstrate a minimum 10% increase in biodiversity units compared with the baseline. A final legally binding requirement is that the net gain measures must deliver effects that persist for at least 30 years with conditions monitoring. So this was a very brief introduction of the English BNG system. Looking forward to hear more about this from Gassen. Before presenting Ulrika Lein Trimble, who is the last speaker today, we should add that interesting developments are taking place also in Norway that may have the potential to significantly change the current land use planning system. Arguably, the NRK article series that I talked about in the beginning builds on some significant recent innovations. The NRK mapping was based on a pioneering method for measuring real-time nature loss and spatial changes developed by researchers at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, NINA. Using existing satellite Earth photos taken every fifth day, artificial intelligence and standardized verification methods, near real-time surveillance of nature changes and loss was made possible. This has made a missing link in the Norwegian planning system. This has been a missing link in the Norwegian planning system. So if implemented in land use planning, this can be seen as a giant leap for more coherent real-time monitoring, which again can enable knowledge-based coordination across municipalities and levels of governance. This has been demonstrated for Agder region and the old Viken region, Akershus, Østfold, Buskerud, which systematically developed nature accounting as a basis for intermunicipal coordination. For municipalities, accurate near real-time nature accounts was tested in Nordre Follo municipality, which has been a forerunner in adopting ambitious land degradation neutrality practices in their spatial planning. In a recent survey to Norwegian municipalities, 105 municipalities reported having started with some sort of nature accounting in their municipal planning. Based on this surveys, we found that municipalities that use natural accounting as a steering tool, actively engaging politicians and integrating it into the planning process, report substantially higher levels of safeguarding of nature considerations. So together, the findings, these developments indicate promising innovations of the present land use planning system also in Norway. In this context of land use innovations from below, we will today learn from researcher Ulrika Lein-Trimble from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. Trimble studies the upscaling of ecological compensation in Norway, including mechanisms that shape ecological compensation projects. We often talk about nature accounting and ecological compensation systems as if they are neutral technical tools. Well, Trimble will discuss how the performance of ecological compensation in Norway hinges on the social, institutional, and political context surrounding each project. So with this introduction, I'm happy to welcome Christian Tvedt as the first speaker, and I will stop sharing my presentation and deliver and then escape. And hopefully Christian will be able to show his presentation.
You are muted, Christian.
All good? You see it well now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just start. And thank you, Marte, for the introduction. I'll just start by connecting to your introduction and say that we know that 1 million species are threatened with extinction and that very few habitats are untouched by human activity. And Marte showed the satellite measurements of the loss of nature, but measuring the loss of nature poses some significant challenges. And this differs from climate change, where we can measure the concentration of different climate gases in the atmosphere, the traces in ice core or in sedimentary rock over geological time, millions of years back. And the measurement of nature loss needs not only detailed satellite mapping, of the Earth's surface and seas, but biologists in the field who can assess the health of forests and wetlands and grasslands and other habitats. Not to mention the millions of species living there. But what we can measure with more confidence is land take. So we have built up areas where the construction of housing and industry, roads or cabins displaces nature. And what this map shows is the future land take in Norwegian municipalities if master zoning plans are realized. So the darker spots mean more area for future development in their zoning plans, the municipal zoning plans. And the thing is that in Norway, municipalities have significant autonomy over land development, as Marte started talking about. The local democracy in each municipality makes decisions on zoning plans where areas are marked for planned development in the future. So then the question is, what are the factors that explain this huge variation in planned development areas between different municipalities? Let me continue shortly. Sorry, here we go. So we see that, let's start here. Is this land take necessary? What is the state of land take in Norway? So we see firstly here that total land take is very high. So while less than 2% of the land is built up in Norway, the total land take per person, so our consumption of land since the dawn of time, is far higher than the rest of Europe. And as Marte Instedt showed before me, the recent land take per person here, the per capita land take in recent years, since from 2018 to 2023, surpasses other European countries, which is a dark omen. And the map here displays a similar pattern on the right. The land take relative to population growth is what we see. This is from an article published in a special issue this summer from our colleagues in the Ecogaps project. And you see that the blue and pink regions have increased land take per capita, and the green regions have not. And especially the dark green spots show the municipalities who have actually managed to grow by population without increased land take. And this just shows that it is possible to have a more, let's say, nature responsible consumption of land. And then let's go stop with the hindsight and see into the future. So the projected population growth should be calibrated to the future land take in the zoning plans. That would be the ideal situation, where each municipality actually plan their land take with respect to the expected, and maybe optimistically, but the expected population growth in the region. But we see that the population growth is considerably slower than future land take in the zoning plans. And this is the big issue when we see look at the decentralized governance system in Norway, where the municipalities are responsible for managing their own land reserves. And now let's look a bit at the context here. So we have, I would say, the structural pressures are twofold. We have the strong growth pressure in municipalities, and these local politicians have very tough choices to make, I would say, especially in rural communities affected by depopulation. So the question is, should they stop development, and landowners who want activities in these small towns left behind by urbanization? The politicians may feel pressure to allow construction in natural areas, especially during coalition formation. We expect different parties to use land areas as political currency in negotiations, where they can hold different goals for the future of their local societies and negotiate for these goals. And that makes these natural areas into bargaining chips in negotiations. And we also have this steering pressure, which is what we call it in the Norwegian context, where the Norwegian municipalities are legally obliged to deliver nearly 500 services and tasks by central government. So these tasks and services range from the welfare services such as childcare and education, especially primary education, some health and care, especially healthcare services, a bit of local transport and roadworks. And well, there's nearly 500 services, and the exact number is not that important. But the point is that the task load is considerable but it is not that considerable on this specific political issue on land policy. There are very few regulations that mandate the municipalities to be better and sustainable land use. So here are the factors that can halt land take from a recent or a forthcoming article that will be published later this week. So you can look into the methodology there for the interested. We have the structural factors. So we have system capacity, for example. We did a huge mapping of factors that could impact the planned development areas. And we expect the planned development areas to be smaller in municipalities that have larger administrations, meaning more systemic capacity, stronger fiscal balance, or more economic headroom, you could say. And if they have more personnel with knowledge of biodiversity and nature, we expect these factors to halt land take. And then to the political ones, we see that we expect ideology and political structure to affect it. We see that a classic trade-off in the literature is the political priorities. So should a party prioritize conservation and the environment over economic growth? This is a cleavage in modern societies that structures party competition across many Western democracies. And this table shows that the voters of 4 green parties prioritize the environment above all else, and that is the voters of the Red Party from left to right, the Social Left, the Greens, and the Liberals. So the voters of the remaining 5 parties are less concerned in this local election we will investigate in the article. And then additionally, we have a look at fragmentation, where more parties get a seat at the table. So you could say that when more parties, when more actors whose demands must be met are having a seat at the table in coalition formation, the fragmentation of the municipal council increases, giving more players bargaining power. And this can lead to over-budgeting of development areas with a harmful effect in nature. Let's look at the planned development areas then. This is what it looks like when we take the relative planned development areas by size, municipal size. So we'll have a look at more than 2,000 square kilometers allocated in these 3 categories, housing, cabins, and industry. This amounts to nearly 40% of already built up area of all land take in Norway today. We weight it by total area, and we see that the large issue with having large areas for planned development is that this increases the risk of overzoning. And we wanted to test this as well, because you could say that if municipalities have set aside large areas for future land take, maybe they have just saved up development areas for later. And this is not the case. Instead, we see that large reserves in the municipalities are associated with that municipality having high land take over the past decade. So the high consumption municipalities in the past are also the high consumption municipalities in the future. So this is the question: what share of municipal areas have local politicians allocated for development in each municipality? And so just to see the range here, we have the lowest, maybe the best in class municipality at 1 per mil. So that's 0.1% of the municipality set aside for planned development. The current built up area, the current land take in Norway is at 2.1%, 21 per mil, and the largest share of the municipality to be allocated for development is at 73 per mil, or 7.3% of the total area, which is let's say 350% of the total land take in Norway in comparison, 3.5 times. So the large challenge here is that once an area is allocated for development, a zoning plan or other provisions is required before construction can take place. But we see that adopted land use plans can over budget or over zone with available land, and that will create expectations among developers. And this can increase the risk of leading to bad decisions, bad prioritization of areas, which can be more harmful for nature. So just let's run through the results from a forthcoming article. As I said, you can have a look at the methodology, but this is just some results of standardized coefficients from regression models. And we see that the stronger green parties, the red dots on the left-hand side here, are associated with less planned line take. We see that stronger party competition, the blue ones on the right, are associated with higher planned line take. So that means that the higher fragmentation in the municipal council, the higher the land take, future planned land take will be when we control for the rest of the variables. And lastly, higher system capacity on the left here is associated with less planned land take, which is expected. You would expect a larger administration to have more possibilities of limiting the land take and limiting the bad prioritizations in the municipal council in the adoption of the master zoning plans. I'm so sorry for not translating all of this from Norwegian. And we see that the effects of party ideology and fragmentation, the red and blue ones, are more robust than the effect of fiscal balance, or the black number 5 here on the left-hand side, which is not significant in both models. So this means that it's disposable tax revenue in the municipality, which we would expect could lead local politicians to plan for more land take, to come to developers and ask them to get some activity, some going in the municipality. This is not the case from these preliminary models, at least. Just to show you the effects, here are the average marginal effects, the predicted effect on the planned development area. And I just want to illustrate how much planned development area decreases when conservation-oriented parties, the green parties, gain support and secure more councils more seats in a municipal council. So the plot on the right here shows the effect of these parties getting additional representatives in an election. And when they advance, when they grow, the land reserve shrinks. And when these green parties lose ground in an election, the land reserves looks like they are growing when we control for other factors. As you would expect, the green parties have an effect. So just to visualize it a bit more, this is the expected effect of a major electoral swing. So say you have green parties growing by 40% in an election. In a landslide, that would amount to a 6 per mil reduction in the relative land reserve. And what does this mean? Well, it means, to make it very concrete, for a fairly typical municipality of typical size, or the median area, which would amount to Kristiansand or Halden in the Norwegian context, but the typical municipality, the predicted effect is 6 per mil, which amounts to nearly like the areas that a municipality like Haugesund, which is relatively large, have set aside or allocated for development in total. So this means that with a landslide in a typical municipality, we would expect land reserves to fall with the same amount as other typical municipalities, which is pretty large when we control for other factors, that is. And just lastly, let's go to the solutions before my fellow presenters will take it further. So how can ecosystem accounting strengthen land use planning? And these are some results from another article me and Marte here published this summer on ecosystem accounting and the implementation in Norwegian municipalities. So the thing here is that ecosystem accounting is used to map the extent and the condition of nature over time. And they can play an important role in land use planning. They can shed light on the consequences of land take, such as loss of biodiversity and agricultural land, and carbon stores in peatlands and pollinating activities. And we know that policymakers need more decision-relevant knowledge about natural areas in order to make good choices. So translating between expert knowledge and politics in a way, this nature accounting framework can function as a bridging tool. And it is being implemented in many municipalities, and it will measure the supply of ecosystem services in the future. It consists of let's see here, five. It consists of five, let's say, components that are interconnected. So we have the land accounts, the condition account, ecosystem services, etc. And the purpose is to capture the value of ecosystem services. So we measure the degradation and restoration of nature when this is implemented fully. And the important thing is here is that this framework is pretty new. It was adopted in 2021 in the UN, and this new framework resolves a long-standing problem that's in earlier generations of environmental accounting meant that natural resources earlier were treated as valueless without value until they were exploited, which is obviously a huge problem. So in the older UN accounting framework for nature, you could say that a tree only has acquired value the moment you log it, the moment it is felled. So, but we do know now that nature provides many ecosystem services that cannot be measured this way. So you think of air purification, flood protection, and carbon storage, services that we need nature intact to get. So the important thing here is that this new ecosystem accounting methodology addresses this problem by capturing the value of nature before it is exploited. And I will finish up by summarizing some findings. And we see that several municipalities in Norway have implemented some ecosystem accounting frameworks, at least adopted some components of it. This table is showing that the combined blue ones are 108 municipalities in a survey who have implemented ecosystem accounting in some way. And we see that of these 108 who have implemented it, we see that 37 of them, which is quite significant, it's more than 10% of the Norwegian municipalities, have implemented ecosystem accounting, and they use them as a political steering tool. They have implemented it in, for example, in financial plans in the municipality or in land use strategies. And this is the key thing. The key thing is where how they use the implementation of these knowledge-based framework like ecosystem accounting. What we do here is we take a look at how different types of nature accounting can be implemented more instrumentally. And these municipalities who have implemented them in an instrumental way state that this has led them to be more sustainable. Just to wrap up, we see that the political leadership shapes land use policy. And some municipalities perform far better at protecting nature. They voluntarily implement safeguards for natural areas. And this means that local elections matter greatly for biodiversity. But we need better knowledge about the nature that may be lost, and this will lead to better decisions and priorities, or even more scrutiny if harmful decisions are taken. So as long as voters don't know what nature is lost through development processes, land take remains a democratic blind spot. And we see that there's a need for better knowledge frameworks. There can sometimes be some limited gain from net zero land take policies, what we call arealneutralitet in Norwegian. If they are voluntary, they are adopted more often in municipalities that already use land efficiently. So we need maybe not mandatory net zero land take policies in specific, but we do need more mandatory use and more mandatory sustainable use of land areas in Norwegian municipalities. Lastly, regional cooperation can be very, very important as well. It can help avoid land use leakage, and we see that the regional authorities on the county level can take crucial advisory roles. They can advise municipalities that need knowledge systems, and we just need them to have this coordinating role over the municipalities to let's say increase not the centralization of the land use system, but at least the coordination of and the mapping of nature loss. So let me end there and leave the words to Sofus and Ulrika. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Very interesting. Now, we do have time for questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your digital hand, or you may write it in the comments field. What I think is, yes,
yeah,
Christian?
we will also do questions afterwards.
Yes,
if
we
some people can
will.
think.
So if there are any questions now, we perhaps can take one. Or we can just take also a short 5 minutes break as scheduled, and then return. I think we will then start in 5 minutes. So we'll take a 5 minutes break now, and then we will start up again at 9:42. Okay, that'll in 5 minutes. Then we'll take a short break now. Thank you. Christian, kan du slutte å dele din presentasjon, tror du? Takk. Sophus, if you're here, perhaps we should start sharing your presentation, and I will introduce you before we start up again.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Well, it's 9:42, so let's start up again. I'm delighted that an increasing number of European countries are now reviewing their planning systems to shift them into a more nature responsible direction, and England is perhaps the country that has come the furthest. We are delighted that a researcher and nature finance lead at the Oxford University, Dr. Sophus Armgassen, is here to share from his research and about the English BNG system. So please, Mr. Armgassen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know. I live in the countryside, so my internet just went down. I don't know if that delayed your call or not. I'm sorry, because I dropped out of the call. Okay, so I'm really excited for this. This is a really cool seminar, and I'm really happy to be involved. Christian, that was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. I was actually feverishly changing my talk based on your talk because there's some more. I didn't realize there'd be such a focus on the political economy of land take. So we've actually done a little bit of work on this in the UK. I've just introduced this to the beginning of my talk in real time. So first, I'll talk about the big picture of the ecological economics of land take and infrastructure, which is something that I've been working on for about the last 10 years. And then we'll go in for the last 20 minutes or so, right? We'll talk about exactly how England's system works. The big picture here is so interesting for ecological economics and land use policy generally, right? It is that globally, we are going through the most rapid expansion of infrastructure in human history. It's estimated that we're going to add the built area of Japan to the global building stock every year for the next 40 years. That's kind of incalculably large. This is just an infographic that demonstrates, what urban sprawl and urban growth looks like in Las Vegas over a 30-year period. It looks like we're going to add 4 million kilometers of new roads over a 30-year period. We're already a substantial chunk through that initial research period. And it's estimated, according to the Global Infrastructure Hub, we're going to spend over $60 trillion on new infrastructure in the next 20 years, right? So what is the problem with this growth model? Well, the problem is that if we actually follow this trajectory using existing production technologies, there literally isn't enough ecological space for it. Things don't add up anymore. If we follow this trajectory, we actually toast, right? So energy is used in building and using infrastructure. Building it in your embodied emissions, using it in all of the ways that we use infrastructure. For reference, if you would just use existing fossil infrastructure to the end of its existing operational lifetime, that blows the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees of warming. So just using existing stuff blows our budgets, and just building the infrastructure projected in emerging economies using 2013 production technology, so that it's slightly outdated. Things have become more efficient since then. But just building the infrastructure, the embodied emissions alone, again, uses nearly all of the global carbon budget. So we just can't do infrastructure in the way that we used to do infrastructure, and no policy frameworks have really accommodated this. Now, this is work from Dominic Wiedenhofer demonstrating infrastructure stock projections. So under various scenarios, like how infrastructure stocks projected to grow, and you can see that it's growing. It's projected to grow basically linearly. And the real question at the heart of this, right, in the heart of land use planning and infrastructure and ecological economics, is how much infrastructure do we really need to satisfy all human needs? How much land take is really empirically required for everybody to live a good quality of life? And this is actually something that the graph that got me inspired on this journey 7 years ago now. A really nice review by Habel et al., which basically just maps the social progress index. So that is an indicator of welfare that is not directly linked to GDP. So it's an indicator of societal progress, a composite of various things like democratic participation, life expectancy, etc. Right? So it's an indicator of basically living a good life. And on the x-axis, we have material stocks of concrete per capita, how much infrastructure societies have. And what's so interesting about this graph, I think, is that you can see that countries have incredibly different ecological efficiencies of their infrastructure systems. Some countries meet a huge, substantial proportion of their citizens' basic needs with much, much smaller infrastructure stocks than others. So in this graph, in the most extreme comparison, New Zealand achieves a higher quality of life for its citizens than the Czech Republic with 20% of the material stocks. So with 20% of the infrastructure, basically. So this tells us something very important for the future of land use policy in the 21st, 22nd, 23rd centuries. It's not how much infrastructure and land take you have that determines your citizens' quality of life. Other stuff is going on here. So why did I get interested in this stuff that then led me into England's compensation system? England's a really nice case study for these kinds of trade-offs, the ecological economics of infrastructure. We did this assessment a few years ago, right? At the time that we did this assessment, the cumulative carbon budget for 1.5 degrees of warming for the UK was 2.5 gigatons. And already, that was for 1.5 degrees. Already at the time, the carbon budget was actually aligned with 2 degrees of warming, right? So that was 5.9 degrees. That was 5.9 gigatons that was implied by the net zero strategy. Now, we also have like inbuilt policy objectives for achieving halting the loss of biodiversity. Today, we're going to be talking about biodiversity net gain under the Town and Country Planning Act, but we also have ambitions to halt wildlife declines under the England's environmental improvement framework. And all of these are mandated in policy. 1 second, my dog is being super weird. I'm just going to let it out. I'm going to have to let it back in again in a bit. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so basically, what does this all mean? What does the ecological economics of infrastructure really look like? Well, this is a paper that we did a couple of years ago called A Home for All Within Planetary Boundaries. And it basically asked, how can we satisfy society's housing needs, but without blowing the carbon budget? And we basically ran a bunch of simulations. I worked together with experts in material flow analysis, the embodied emissions of carbon, of housing, the operational emissions of housing, the political economy of housing, finance, economics, and a bit of post-growth political economy. And basically, we came up with this holistic picture of how we could satisfy society's housing needs, but without transgressing our carbon or biodiversity budgets. And the kind of baseline scenario, this is our scenario one, basically status quo. And the scary thing is, if you add up the operational and embodied emissions of the UK housing system up to 2050, stuff that's basically locked in under the status quo policy of building 300,000 homes per year, then housing alone consumes England's entire carbon budget for 1.5 degrees of warming, right? So we just can't do infrastructure the way that we used to do infrastructure if we genuinely aim to remain within planetary boundaries. Now, of course, there's lots of economists who say that actually that's not what the objective should be. But I'm an ecological economist, so I think that that is what the objective should be. So we then modeled other potential scenarios for this, and basically they're just scenarios that vary the amount of decarbonization of the existing stock and the rate of housing construction. The highlight results of these models are basically the best thing that you can do for creating a housing system that minimizes its carbon footprint is by improving the operational emissions of the existing housing stock. So that is retrofitting existing, very inefficient buildings. And then the best thing that you can do, that addresses the vast majority of the problem. And then also reducing the amount of housing construction is an important part of the picture. So in the baseline scenario, the embodied emissions in constructing new housing in line with the government's housing targets, that consumes 12% of the carbon budget on its own. So we also model scenarios where we basically use the existing stock more efficiently and satisfy more housing need without more land take. I have to let it on. Okay, so that's what the picture looks like for carbon. Then I don't have time to go into detail, but we did this super detailed exploration of the political economy of why we are stuck in a high land take, high housing expansion scenario, and what we can do. What are the actual potential levers in policy, in the financial system, etc., to reduce basically the amount of land required to satisfy people's housing needs. Again, from an ecological economic perspective, one of the main solutions here is people should get used to living in smaller homes. That is by far the strongest predictor of whether or not we can decarbonize the housing stock, is how much space we actually need to decarbonize. And so, I mean, one of the policies that we advocate here is basically people living in smaller homes, but having greater public service provision so that you don't need a home to satisfy all of your needs. You can actually satisfy them in other ways, right? So that's the big picture of what an ecological economic approach to the future of urbanization and land take would look like. But so there's a lot about political economy in that paper, A Home for All Within Planetary Boundaries. That it's, in my opinion, it's my best ever paper. And I won't go into that stuff in detail, but basically to say we just can't do land take and infrastructure like we used to. So now that was all about carbon. How does this translate into biodiversity? So the rest of this talk is going to be introducing you to our biodiversity market-like system, our attempt to integrate biodiversity into land use considerations. It all hinges on the way that we measure nature. And the way that we measure nature is basically some process that happened over about a 12-year period. English government went through some pilots in 2010, from 2010 to 2012. These pilots really failed. They didn't manage to trigger a single trade. But in some local governments, they went ahead with this system anyway. And then actually over the next 12 years, they developed a lot of expertise and practice. 12 years later, the system that had previously failed nationally then became mandatory in law. So in 2024, the beginning of last year, this thing became mandatory in law. And now it means that every new development in England needs to achieve a 10% increase in biodiversity. Now, that biodiversity is measured using this statutory biodiversity metric. It is basically an area condition metric. So in ecology, that's basically something where you look at how big all your habitats are and how good all your habitats are, and you multiply those things together to get an overall index, a value for their combined size and quality. The baseline calculation is you take the size of each habitat on your site. So a consultant literally goes to each site where a new development is proposed, and they map out every small little habitat fragment on the site, and they get the area of those, and they multiply it by its distinctiveness, which is basically a score that the government determined for different habitats of different levels of conservation priority. So important stuff has a higher distinctiveness, unimportant stuff has a lower distinctiveness, and then multiplied by the vegetation condition of the site. And again, they provide basically a structured decision-making framework for telling you whether or not a site is in a good or bad condition, and it's based on some of the ecological characteristics of the site itself. So you basically do this for the site before you build your infrastructure, and then you make a projection of what the site will look like after you've built your infrastructure. And you do the same calculation, but you also get penalized basically for delivering stuff in the future. So if you say in 30 years' time, I'm going to have a beautiful site that will have woodlands and grasslands built into it, then the value of those woodlands and grasslands is discounted by how far in the future you will be delivering them. So basically, what this means is it penalizes you for delivering really ambitious stuff in the future and rewards you for delivering stuff either that's already been delivered, and that sets up the habitat banking system, or stuff that will develop very, very quickly. So that's sort of moderate condition grasslands that can emerge quite quickly. There is a small spatial incentive. So for the land use optimization crowd on the call, there is a small spatial incentive for delivering stuff in the right places from an ecological perspective. So there is a linkage between what we call the biodiversity net gain system and another one of our policies that were embedded in the Town and Country Planning Act, which is what we call the local nature recovery strategies. And basically the Norwegian equivalent here would be if every municipality had to come up with its spatial plan for how it's going to achieve its biodiversity objectives. But we have that in England, so it's a new policy, and you get a small incentive to deliver stuff in the areas that is good for your local nature spatial plan. We've just done some work to model whether or not that incentive is actually big enough. I won't present it here today, but we've got a preprint that's coming out in a couple of weeks. Okay, now what are the properties embedded in an area condition metric? Well, one of them is your area is multiplied by your condition. So if you promise something of a really good condition or distinctiveness in the future, this metric allows you to perfectly substitute between large areas of low condition and small areas of high condition. But this metric can actually completely facilitate land take as long as the remaining habitats are in a better condition than existing habitats. Now, we've done this, we've collected data on what's actually happening in English developments, and in the total area allocated, the space allocated for developments under biodiversity net gain, in our data, the biodiversity net gain objective was easily achieved. It exceeded the 10% uplift required to be legal. But actually, this resulted in a 38% reduction in open green space, in what you might call land take. So the metric has not in any way stopped land take. That's not what it's been trying to do. Now, here's a slide I like. These are random things I've pulled out from the many hundreds of planning applications that I've read. The left-hand side is what I consider a very bad legal biodiversity net gain assessment. So the thing that we kind of want to avoid, but is still legal. And the right-hand side is what I would consider a very good biodiversity net gain assessment, also legal. So both of these things are completely legal, but they use the metric in different ways. They have different intentions, I would say. So the left-hand side shows you the top left is just a field. And it's a field that has a little bit of bramble in it. It's got a little bit of woodland. It's actually probably something that could be restored to a decent ecological condition. And the bottom left shows you the development they were planning. So basically, they're building on most of it, and then they are achieving their biodiversity net gain objective by promising that they're going to deliver beautiful grasslands in the cracks in between the houses. And that is legal under the biodiversity net gain system. But it's not, I think, done with the intention of achieving a biodiversity net gain. It's an artifact of the specific way we measure biodiversity, right? Which is just habitat multiplied by quality, multiplied by what kind of habitat it is. Whereas the development on the right-hand side is quite different. It is the development on a big chunk of cropland, and you can see that they've built on half the site, retained cropland on a quarter of the site, and restored the bottom quarter of the site into a nature area. And that is, I think, done with much more the intention of biodiversity net gain. And so they have, actually contributed to nature conservation objectives by creating an area managed for nature and people in the site. Okay, so now you can visualize the different ways that you can achieve your objective. One of the problems of our metric, when you use these area condition metrics, all they're measuring, right, is the quality of the habitat. They're not actually measuring the biodiversity in the habitat. And that's a problem because if there is other stuff going on, and any landscape ecologists will tell you that there is, that determines what the biodiversity of your site is, then measuring the vegetation condition actually might not tell you anything about the quality of your site in terms of biodiversity. And in fact, that's exactly what we've found. So Natalie Duffus, who's an incredible PhD student who I'm lucky to co-supervise, spent 2 years out in fields measuring the biodiversity metric scores and measuring the real observed invertebrate abundance using pitfall traps and eDNA. And a bit of manual counting and biomass. So basically different measures of working out how much invertebrate life there was on these sites. And the overarching finding is that regressions find no relationship, basically. So there is no relationship between actual life on the sites and the biodiversity metric score. So I present this work a lot, and I advise government a lot, and I would say that the way that you should visualize the biodiversity metric is actually not as a biodiversity metric. It is not a measure of biodiversity. You should visualize it as a convenient unit to commodify nature and enable measurement and trade. But it is not a measure of biodiversity. It does something else that's useful, but it's not a biodiversity measure. So this means, of course, that it is perfectly possible for our nature metric to go up and real biodiversity to go down, that they actually don't really, there's no real relationship between the two of them. There are some caveats to this research. It was only done in grasslands, for example. And of course, there are other habitats included in the system, but grasslands are the vast majority of the system. Okay, so that's step one on the scientific sort of issues. Now, what are the actual trades in habitats that are occurring? Well, this is a paper that we published from the policy is quite young, so we were studying it for 4 years before it became mandatory, by studying what was happening in the municipalities, the local authorities, where stuff happened before it happened nationally. And basically, on the top graph, this is the area of different habitats, and each column represents a habitat, and you can see, and then the left-hand column is what was there before the developments were built, and the right-hand column is what is there after the developments were built. And the bottom graph is the same measure, but for the biodiversity units rather than the area of habitats. And basically what you need to know from this figure is cropland goes down a lot, modified grassland goes down a lot, and that's basically pasture. Other neutral grassland, which is sort of reasonably biodiverse but highly variable, easy to create grasslands, they go up a lot, and built urban surface goes up a lot. So basically, what this system, the habitat trades that the system is facilitating, is actually a loss of cropland and pasture, an increase in grassland that is variable but managed, often managed for wildlife, and a big increase in a land take. Right? I say increase in land take, as in land take is facilitated under the policy. I don't know how the land take compares with before the policy was introduced. So that's not what my reference is here. And the other very interesting finding in our research was that the actual market for biodiversity units, so that's developers who cannot meet their 10% biodiversity objective within their own developments, have to buy the residual from the market. And actually, we found the market was much, much smaller than government was going to predict, or had predicted in its impact assessment. At the time, we found it was 7.4% of units. In reality now, it's actually much, much smaller than that. We'll get onto this. But the biodiversity net gain system is often confused for the market. It's actually not. It's mostly the enhancement of nature within developments, and the market is actually a tiny fragment of it. Now, what are some of the properties of the biodiversity net gain system? The left-hand figure shows you all of the developments in our data set. And basically, stuff that is on the right-hand side of the y-axis meets all of its biodiversity liabilities within the site itself. You can see that most big developments meet all of their liabilities on their own site. And that's because they have land to play with. So they can promise that they're going to deliver like high quality land in the future within their developments. But you can see on the left-hand side of the graph is many smaller developments, the ones that don't have land to play with, and those guys need to buy offsets from the market. So it's systematically, the demand is coming from really small sites. recent analysis by Natalie Duffers has demonstrated about 40% of demand comes from sites that are less than a hectare in size. Now, one of the really interesting properties of this system, probably the most important property of this system, is that we have different governance regimes for the stuff that's delivered on site versus the stuff that's delivered through the market. Stuff that's delivered on site is governed through the existing planning enforcement system. So that is municipalities have the responsibility for monitoring and ensuring that stuff is delivered. Whereas for the off-site market, the completely different governance regime, that is often market-led private governance. So companies come in and are awarded contracts for monitoring the ecological quality of those sites. And basically, in some of these papers, we explain why this is problematic. In the UK, local authorities are severely understaffed, and they do not have the capacity to actually perform their function. So we are seriously concerned that a lot of the stuff that's delivered within developments is actually not going to be delivered in reality. The graph on the right shows you, it's our attempt at quantifying how many of these biodiversity units are at serious risk of non-compliance. And we find it's about a quarter of the policy. About a quarter of the policy, we think, is at serious risk of not being delivered. All right, now, talking a little bit about the off-site market. So this little bit of the policy, which is the thing that people are very excited about internationally, because it's the thing that is supposed to be generating private investment in nature conservation. But the government, English government, has a kind of interesting love-hate relationship with its own market. The environmental government departments basically really like it and want it to expand because they want to attract more private investment in nature. But I would say the departments that are more focused on fiscal sustainability and on housing and reducing the cost of living and improving access to housing generally want to increase the exemptions in this policy. So they generally want to reduce the size of the market. So this leads to an interesting tension where different departments, I think, have different attitudes towards the market. But basically, the market is much, much smaller than people were predicting. And that is, in my belief, partly because of the evidence that we assembled, that developers are incentivized implicitly to deliver stuff within their developments that is kind of legally unenforceable. So stuff that they can't really be held to account for not delivering. So that absorbs, I think, quite a lot of demand from the market. And another piece of evidence that's come out recently is actually there has been the widespread application of exemptions from the policy, which is something that's been super understudied. Only some preliminary sort of consultancy analyses have come out and discovered that, you know, over 80% of things that should be delivering a biodiversity net gain have been exempt, and we still don't really understand the reasons why. It's super interesting. So I'm keeping an eye on that. But basically, in the off-site market, Natalie Duffers assembled, digitalized all of the data of the publicly available data on the off-site market, and built a database of all of these habitat banks. And the figure on the right-hand side shows you the area of habitat that is registered in these habitat banks. So at the time, there was over 4,000 hectares of conservation area that had been registered for delivering units into the market. But at the time, less than 2% of it had actually sold. So there'd been no buyer for 98% of the market. This is obviously pretty serious because a lot of farmers, especially, have pivoted their business models to be producing biodiversity units for this market. And it is super unclear at this point whether or not their units will get bought. And of course, if you want to expand private investment in nature and private contributions to nature conservation, you kind of want this market to be selling as many units as possible, right? But you can see that there's fundamental tensions within the policy between stuff that wants to basically reduce the environmental regulatory burden, or the perceived environmental regulatory burden for new developments, and those incentives are to reduce the size of the market and the scope of the policy. And other people want to upscale private investment in nature, so that is to increase the size of the market and how many units the market is selling. Most transactions in the market are very small, so the average transaction is 0.2 hectares of habitat. And as I said earlier, like 40% of development of demand comes from quite small developments that are less than 1 hectare in size. That's very problematic because the government is currently consulting on reducing the scope of biodiversity net gain to make smaller developments exempt. And I don't think they realize how much demand that will pull out of the already very demand constrained market. Okay, onto the spatial planning side. So the way our policy works, you can see now, I've explained a bit of how it works. It is basically incentivizing developers to deliver nature within their developments. What we did in this paper is run a bunch of spatial optimizations where we actually optimize the policy for very different objectives. So in short, black represents the status quo. So where nature will be delivered in the policy under the status quo incentives in the system, which is delivering stuff as close to your development as possible and without much spatial incentive or targeting. And the green represents where you would place this stuff nationally to maximize its biodiversity value. The orange represents where you would place this stuff if you wanted to minimize the opportunity cost. So the place achieving the regulatory objective at least cost, but not optimizing for biodiversity. The purple represents how you maximize the overall ecosystem service value of the potential compensation. And the pink represents how you maximize the equity weighted benefit. So that is basically prioritizing putting stuff near disadvantaged populations who disproportionately benefit from the value of ecosystem services. And what the highlight of this is you can see that different designs give you very different outcomes. And actually, like when you do the spatial prioritization of a land use policy, what you optimize for dramatically changes your spatial distribution of the way that you deliver that policy. And the status quo system doesn't optimize for any objective. It's a kind of compromise between lots of different policy objectives. And you can see it's outperformed on at least one dimension by each of the other spatial plans for the policy. Very good. Okay. Conclusions about the biodiversity net gain system. It's really early days. It's only a year and a half old. So this thing is evolving pretty quickly. And, you know, my group is keeping a close eye on it. Yeah, it's consistently providing scientific advice and responding to all the government consultations to keep people informed about what's actually happening here. The system has generated less investment in nature than initially expected, and that's because of this very interesting political economic tension within government. Because different government departments have different objectives, some for minimizing the cost of compliance, others for improving private investment in nature. We have fallen into the same trap that lots of biodiversity markets around the world fall into, which is creating multiple competing pathways for achieving compliance. So delivering stuff through the market is more ecologically robust, but more expensive. And so people are not, by default, going through the on-site delivery, which is cheaper, but has a much higher probability of having lower ecological quality. Now, because a lot of the biodiversity net gain system is delivering promises of future high-quality habitats, actually the outcomes are really going to rely on long-term monitoring to ensure that those promises made today are actually kept in 10, 20, 30 years. And we have some serious enforcement challenges within the planning system. That means that currently, I think this is a major governance gap. People are working on it, but right now, I do not expect many of the promises made today to actually yield biodiversity improvements in 20 years' time for the stuff that's being delivered through the built environment. So that's being delivered within the developments themselves. And we've got our biodiversity metric. As I say, don't conceptualize it as a biodiversity metric. Conceptualize it as a very convenient way of commodifying nature to enable a unit of trade that is very simple to use, but it's not actually correlating with what an ecologist would call biodiversity. And so, yeah, there's opportunities to iteratively improve that metric over time, so it's a stronger correlate with actual ecological quality, observed biodiversity, if you will. Thanks so much. I'm excited for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. And I guess there are many questions to you, Sophus. But due to time, let's move directly to researcher Ulrika Lein-Trimble, and then we will have time for questions and discussions afterwards. So please, Ulrika, you will talk about Norwegian developments now.
Yes, thank you very much, Marta, for the introduction, and thank you, Christian, also for highlighting some of the political structures that we have in Norway and in planned development, and also thank you, Sophus, for this introduction or this crash course in the English biodiversity net gain system. And I just want to double check if it's showing slides and not present to view.
Yes, everything
Yes.
okay.
Okay, good. Yes. So I would like to say that Sophus has touched upon a lot of interesting and quite important challenges with this type of a system or a metric, and I'm not going to go into all of that, but I really liked what you said, and there are some interesting differences that we need to consider if we are to implement a similar system in Norway. I will share some of the perspectives to some of them. So I've been asked to comment and give some reflections from a Norwegian perspective on the challenges and opportunities for a biodiversity net gain system in Norway. And to do so, I will give a brief overview of the state of the art of net gain policies and development in Norway, and I will give some examples from the transportation sector and the challenges that arise with the ecological compensation. But before I do so, I'd like to say something about my background to give you an idea of my approach to this topic. So I'm currently in the late stages of my PhD, and I plan on submitting sometime in the spring of 26. My PhD is a part of the Rescape project, which is funded by the NFR. And as a part of the project of Rescape and my PhD is that we're looking into drivers and barriers for upscaling ecological restoration in Norway. And I'm writing my PhD within the field of science, technology, and society studies at NTNU in Trondheim. And I'm having so I'm using a qualitative research method to focus on retrospective case studies related to ecological restoration practices. And this is how I'm mainly interested in looking into the composition of actors, technologies of governance, policies and societal controversies, standards and knowledge production that are in play in these projects. So this is how I got introduced to the framework of ecological compensation, net loss and mitigation hierarchy. So what are the challenges and opportunities for a biodiversity net gain system in Norway? So the first thing I would like to pay attention to from the English system is that it's made mandatory for developers to deliver a net gain of 10% through the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990. And as Sophus mentioned, the ecologists measure the biodiversity of the existing habitat and then advise for suitable habitat creation for the land. So what's unique about this, in contrast to a Norwegian context, is that there is a statutory metric tool and to calculate the number of biodiversity in an existing habitat. So there is a formula, kind of. In Norway, there is no standardized operationalization of how to measure and calculate net gain or net loss for biodiversity. So when a developer plan on doing some intervention, they are required to follow the regulations for impact assessments through the Plan and Building Act of 2008. And according to Section 23 in this regulation, the assessment should describe planned measure to avoid, minimize, restore, or compensate for significant adverse impacts on the environment and society, both during the construction and the operational phases. So this is also known as the mitigation hierarchy, which is a model in which the developer is required to prioritize measures that avoid negative impacts that are caused by the intervention. And further, there are some requirements that developers in Norway need to follow, which is that nature, in Norway, the nature is managed through regulations at different levels of governance. And according to the Environmental Impact Assessment Regulation, an impact assessment shall always provide the basis for ensuring that principles set out in the Nature and Diversity Act in Section 8 till 12, which are intersecting two different sectors, basically. And in these sections, there are some basic principles for what you need to consider when you're doing these assessments. So both regulations are sector-wide. However, area and land use allocation outside conservation areas is implemented in municipal plans and governed by the Plan and Building Act. And another requirement that could have an impact on how developers can ensure a gain of biodiversity is related to Section 48 in the Nature and Diversity Act. So when it was implemented in 2009, Section 48 required ecological compensation only when intervening inside protected areas. So this is one of, I think, maybe one of the biggest challenges for one of these laws is that the Nature and Diversity Act actually allows intervention in a protected area, and which I've understood is not the case in England, which if it's not allowed or you cannot intervene in a protected area. But Section 48 in Norway does allow that, and that is when compensation is required. So that means when following the mitigation hierarchy, ecological compensation only becomes a requirement if the intervention is happening in protected areas. Otherwise, it is voluntarily or optional to implement compensatory measures. So in the English net gain system, unless there's an exception, developers in England are required to provide a 10% net gain on all habitats. But there has not been a system for requiring a net gain of biodiversity other than these mechanisms that I just presented. So there's no standardized number or method for how much biodiversity units of a given area is mandatory to calculate a net gain. The second thing I would like to pay attention to from the English system is that it is a part of an established offsetting market. And what you said, Sophis, there are problems with that kind of logic as well. And that is that developers can buy or sell areas for compensating ecological values or credits that is not possible to gain within the developing sites. And as I understood it, the net gain, biodiversity net gain system or metrics can be used to find these areas or credits. Norway, we don't have a system in place that allows for a purchasing mechanism like this. And a part of the challenge here is that we have a legal system that doesn't allow buying or selling land. As for example, there are some strict property rules related to reallocation for land use change. So for example, the Land Act for cultivated land, Land Act does say that the cultivated land cannot be used for other purposes than agricultural production. And in one of the ecological compensation cases that I'm going to explain a bit later is some of the proposed areas for restoration as a compensating area was a farmer wanted basically to give his part of the cropland to restore because it it didn't give good produce, or it was a bad part of the crop, so he could just say it. But the law said that he couldn't do that because of this reallocation for land use rule. But there was an assessment of this option for having a market system like this, which was done in 2012 by the Ministry of Transportation. They conducted an assessment for implementing offsetting in Norway. So while markets for buying offsets credits are in place in other countries, it was suggested for a Norwegian context as well, but it has not been followed up, and a part of that is that the legal system, or it's been argued that the legal system is too complicated, and it hasn't been, as far as I know, there hasn't been any development on that site. However, there's been some development in Norway that resembles the approach of a market like this. There's been some development on framework that is supposed to help planners get a holistic overview of nature's condition in all municipalities. This is also what Christian also touched upon, with the concept of area neutrality, where the point is to get a systematic overview that shows how much nature we have and in what condition they are in. The goal is to avoid more intervention in nature, and the idea of area neutrality is to find areas before an intervention starts and in what condition the area is in. So in this way, planners can prioritize using already degraded areas to do construction on, instead of intervening in an area that has a higher or good condition or protected area. But before we can talk about ensuring remaining off-site net gains, this requires a systematic mapping of what kind of nature we have and in what condition it is in. So an example of a systematic mapping of such is the multi-level nature accounting approach to help the politicians and decision makers at a municipal level. So with this approach, the idea is that planners have a holistic map to better assess the effects of an intervention, both before and after. And the main focus is that information about an ecosystem area and their condition, and not whether there's already some intervention there or not. So it's basically a status quo of the conditions. So in this way, you quantify the area, extent, and change of land use, land cover types, and the information can be used to evaluate whether a municipality obtained the goals of land degradation, neutrality, or not. So it can also be used to evaluate whether, for example, ecological restoration does contribute to improve ecosystem condition to reach another target that we have agreed upon, which is the 15% restoration, or 15% target of restored land. And this ecosystem accounting can be used to find replacement areas, for example, for ecological compensation. However, the data available are not sufficient for this purpose yet. A third thing that I would like to highlight from the English system is that the landowner or the developer is legally responsible for managing the habitat for at least 30 years, both on-site and off-site development site. So this long-term perspective is something I think is a source for a lot of disagreement and uncertainties in many development projects in Norway, especially when it comes to ensuring that implemented measures do in fact work in the real world as it does in paper. For example, a developer decides to establish a protected area, again, an example from the transportation sector, compensative measure, or decide to implement some measures that require maintenance within an area managed by local municipalities or local environmental authorities. And these local authorities are often already working with a tight budget. And a consequence of this is that they have to prioritize and might not be able to follow up on the required tasks that is necessary to ensure a good condition of the new area that they are responsible for. So in some way, there is already a mechanism in place for ensuring that developers are responsible for bearing the cost of environmental degradation, which is through the Section 11 in the Nature Diversity Act. But there's not a set number for how long or to what extent that they are required to follow. So I think this is where Norway has a big opportunity to improve today's system, or today's law basically is that the developer takes on the cost for ensuring that measures are meeting the required condition, but also ensuring programs for long-term monitoring at the site. So this is not cheap, but if this is implemented as part of the plan at an early stage, I think we could avoid a lot of conflicts later on in a project. So the example I'm going to use is from the compensation of the E6 highway expansion within Åkersvika Nature Reserve. And in 2013, the Ministry of Environment decided, after 4 years of assessing compensatory measures for replacing ecological values lost due to the construction, a list of requirements needed to be followed. So on this map here, you see in blue is the nature reserve, and straight in the middle, you see the highway, which is intersecting. And among the requirements was that they needed to replace in the ratio of 1 to 3 deca of habitat type outside the reserve. Well, this is in addition to they followed the mitigation hierarchy, and what they couldn't replace or what they couldn't do within the nature reserve, they had to do on the outside. So they had to then expand the reserve 3 times more of what was lost. There was also a requirement for assessments and plans for monitoring and compensation, as well as coordinating the project together with local environmental authorities, which is very unusual, as it's usually the developer who is responsible for the whole project. And some of the challenges that I've already mentioned is related to land regulation, or availability of replacement area. And to meet the requirement of replacing in the ratio of 1 to 3, the closest area that they could find that were of similar habitat type was located 100 kilometers away from the intervention site. So the solution was then to establish the reserve of Stille and Brautstilla Nature Reserve, which is circled in the bottom point. An individual evaluation report was published in 2022, commissioned by the Environmental Agency, and in this evaluation it was concluded that a net gain was achieved mainly based on the gain in area of the same habitat type through the new nature reserve. However, there are some uncertainties that were discussed related to that. There was a lack of post-surveys for comparing pre- and post-intervention. There's also a disagreement for who is responsible for ensuring a monitoring program. This case is very complex, so I haven't gone very detailed in, but a part of the problem or the challenge here is that because of a restructure in the sectorial the sector done by the Solberg's government in 2016, a new company called Nye Veier was given this project from Statens Vegvesen. So a lot of the agreements that were done before that kind of was supposed to be transferred to Nye Veier, but there has been some disagreement of who's responsible for what. As well, there is a lack of data for conditioning for the condition of the new reserve, so they don't really know the comparison of what was lost and what was really gained. But yeah, as I said, the case is complex, but this is the essence of some of the challenges that we need to understand if we implement a standardized metric. The Yeah, so to conclude, the biodiversity net gain is more than just a metric with numbers and units. It is a part of a complex socio-political context. We need to look into the broader legal, social, economic, and political aspects to why a metric like this is successful and why it fails. And I think the basis for implementing a net gain system is there, but we need to be aware of the potential pitfalls of implementing a system to not only focusing on the numbers of what is lost, what is gained, but also the broader context it is conditioned in. And the examples from the ecological compensation has showed that you could, in theory, measure desired conditions and outcomes, but it turns out that it is more challenging. So by also changing the way we manage land use change through mandatory long-term perspectives and potential costs, there are some good opportunities there that needs to be considered. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Ulrika. That was excellent. Really, really interesting. Thank you to all three presenters. I've had a lot of fun. And now let's, you can ask questions. Please, you can either raise your hands or you can also write a question in the comment field. Okay. Are there anyone who would like to start by raising your hand? Or should I start?
There is a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can see it. Okay, I can read it then. Thanks, Ulrika, for the good overview. Asplan Viak, Multiconsult, and Rumble, those are consultant companies in Norway, are working on developing a method similar to biodiversity metric adapted to the Norwegian system of nature classification, NIN, and environmental impact assessment regulations. It might be interesting for some of you. Also, and then there's a link to a report here. So please take a look at the chat. The test version will be evaluated and improved within spring 2026. We hope that it can serve as a basis for a mandatory system for Norway. Okay, thank you for that comment. And there is a person raising your hand, Line Uma. Would you please ask your question or offer your comment?
Thank you so much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you all for a very good presentations. Maybe a little bit a question on the side, but what do you think is like politically possible to do in Norway? What's the interest in actually doing something with these problems with of too much land use in Norway? And how many years do we need to have a system that actually changes the practice we are doing right now? And are we already seeing a change because of all the attention on how we use land and how we build down nature? Or yeah, what do you think? Thank you.
I can begin answering if Ulrika wants to say something about net gain afterwards. But I do think that the establishment of ecosystem accounting, when it is happening, the environmental directorate is working on it currently and has been for some time. And when this rolls out fully and it is not longer just a voluntary measure, I think the knowledge in the municipalities will rise. I think voters will be affected by this, and I think this will lead to, who knows what will happen to the the legal side of it, but I do think that as long as there are pressure from below, things will happen. So I think this development will help at least. But yeah, it is a good question, and it's very hard to see very quick resolutions to this issue.
Yes, Ulrika, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think there has been some challenges before where it is quite what's called the financial or the budgeting part is quite strong in Norwegian planning, and also with environmental governance, that it does require some kind of certainty within within the budgets that and that we're working with. But I think if I don't know if there's some current work going on right now, but as I see in the chat, there are a lot of interest to develop a system. There are a lot of interesting from at least a scientific point of view, but I'm not so sure about the political interest, but I'm sure that there are a lot of at a nation level, that a national level, that there are some interest in it. But there will be interesting to see how this discussion would appear at a higher level as well, to implement and to make the changes that is necessary.
Yes.
Yeah, super. And then to add, okay, so how fast can this stuff happen? A lot of variation across the world in how fast these things have happened. So England started out in 2010, made mandatory in 2024, so that was 14 years. US wetland mitigation, the fundamental policy underpinning it, the Clean Water Act, was introduced in the 1950s. Basically, compensatory mitigation emerged in the 1970s. And then in the 1990s, so that's 20 years later, their market emerged, and then their market went through fundamental reforms in 2008. So that's 38 years to get to like what the contemporary US system looks like. In Australia, they started out, so if we take Victoria started out in 2006. They ran their first offset trials then, and they've been through fundamental reforms in 2013 and 2018, I believe. So you can see that we're talking many decades for them to reach maturity.
Good point there, Sophus, and also the UN's system for nature accounting has taken 30 years to develop, and it's not finished yet. So it is taking a lot of time. And I would like to add to Ulrika and also Christian that we need to enhance the system's connectivity in Norway. So we need governance mechanisms that can enhance the coordination between all the decision-making units. We need stronger mechanisms so that municipalities can move in the same direction. Now, there is a question to you, Sophus. Sophus, you talked about developers being penalized if they did not comply with the policy biodiversity metric. What does that kind of penalty imply?
Yeah, very good. Okay, so again, different governance regimes. There's actually 3 pathways to achieving compliance in net gain. The majority, right, is the delivery of stuff within your development. That's well over 90% of all of the biodiversity units. Basically, the governance system for that is the existing planning enforcement system. So this basically relies on a member of the public reporting to a local authority that something doesn't look right on the site. And then the local authority needs to judge whether or not this violation of a planning condition is severe enough to warrant sanction. And then there's a long process in planning enforcement where it starts with a bunch of warning letters. And then at its most extreme, you get serious penalties, but it's very uncommon to bring anything through to the serious penalty stage. So that is that's the enforcement mechanism for the delivery of on-site stuff. We're seeing a huge amount of very interesting innovation in the beginning of this net gain market. So I think some of the stuff that I find most interesting and inspiring about the net gain market is its innovation, both public and private. But you're seeing, for example, some very good companies coming out and developing really cool systems for assisting local government in basically monitoring and enforcing biodiversity net gain delivered on site, so that then local authorities are buying a subscription to this service that helps them. So it's like solving a real governance challenge. Very interesting. Then the second major pathway is by buying units through the market. The enforcement and governance system for that is you have two different options. You basically need somebody to check your habitat bank. We call that a responsible body. And you have two pathways to achieving a responsible body. One is through local government, through a Section 106 agreement, so basically an agreement with your local authority. And the other one is through a conservation covenant, which is a new legal instrument introduced for biodiversity net gain. So as Ulrika says, a lot of interesting innovation is required to make these systems work. And in the UK, we've seen some of these initial innovations that have been popping up, like legal innovations. So the conservation covenant is a legal instrument for the protection of land for 30 years. And the conservation covenant is overseen most commonly by a private company, actually one main private company in England. And they basically monitor stuff that's happening. And then what the actual enforcement mechanisms are, if you don't comply with your contract, is not in the public domain. So we don't really know. And so it's something I'm keeping an eye on, but we don't really know what happens if the private provider detects that your habitat bank isn't working. And then the third pathway is if you can't do the stuff yourself or buy the stuff from the market, you can buy a statutory credit from government. And to my knowledge, people have invested in this. When I last checked, it had raised something like £300,000, but government had not yet delivered a single unit through that system. So we know nothing basically about that system. It's too early days to say. We do know that the government has spent more in transaction costs than it's received in revenue. So the system that system has really not started functioning yet at all.
Interesting. Okay, so don't be afraid to ask questions, people. I have a question then. I think it's interesting about this 10% increase. Could you say a little bit more about how it works actually, Sophus, in a meaningful way? How does it work in terms of protecting, for instance, especially vulnerable nature? And also, does it have an effects on, let's say, landscape or habitats connectivity?
Yeah, awesome question. Okay, so in my talk, I've presented the way it correlates with real observations of biodiversity on site. And we know that those two things are kind of independent. They don't correlate well. But the 10% thing does do other cool stuff that I didn't mention in my talk. The thing that we think is probably the most effective thing that it does is it prices destroying habitats. So the preliminary signal from our data is what you don't see is a lot of really valuable habitats getting destroyed in the biodiversity net gain system, and that is because it is expensive to replace them. So I'm actually most optimistic about the role that net gain plays in avoiding damaging important stuff. So that I think is something that it's actually hard to study. Avoidance is really hard to study because it's really hard to study the absence of something happening. So it requires sort of careful econometric study, and we haven't been able to get the data to do that yet. But that I think is important. Connectivity, the metric basically initially the first two major rounds and iterations of the metric included a connectivity measure, and then it was dropped because consultants found it too difficult to use, basically. So it does not include a connectivity measure at all. This is probably the single biggest limitation of the metric. In that it rewards area linearly rather than non-linearly. That's a problem because you can compensate with really small stuff, and for nature conservation to work, you want big stuff in the right places, and net gain does not do that at all. So that's what I was alluding to. We've actually just got this paper that we're just about to submit, and we're just about to put a preprint online where we basically model, like, for every single habitat fragment in Oxfordshire, so in one of our municipalities in our county, what is the number of biodiversity units you could get through the net gain market in that place? And then does the thing that gets you the most units in that place, is that actually the thing that we want there? So is that the thing that we want in our local nature recovery strategy? So the preliminary results are kind of super interesting on that. Basically, yes, it's often the thing that we want there, but sort of by accident, and that is because in our specific spatial planning, we give a lot of options for what you could want there. And in many places, the thing that optimizes for the metric is actually the same thing, and that's often what the local nature recovery strategy wants. So it's not designed to deliver a big diversity of habitats. Actually, it really incentivizes the delivery of a very small diversity of habitats. So that's obviously a concern, and that's a concern for like meta population connectivity as well. So the potential way that it disincentivizes ecological heterogeneity is something that we're interested in observing as well. Yeah, no, I think that's everything.
Great. And then one more question here. What is the difference between biodiversity units and habitat type?
Yeah, so the unit is the result of that whole function. So it's area multiplied by distinctiveness, multiplied by condition. What you're calling habitat type is a subcomponent of the distinctiveness score. So basically, what type of grassland that thing is determines whether or not it's given a low or a high distinctiveness in the metric. So basically, stuff that's really rare and valuable would have a high distinctiveness score. Stuff that's really easy to create and very common would have a low distinctiveness score. So that's how habitat type feeds into the metric.
I could just add that habitat type is a Norwegian category within the Norwegian nature in Norway, I think, which is a way of categorizing different types of nature.
Great. Line Oma, do you have one more question?
Yes, thank you. I only want to say also that I represent the Norwegian Association of Landscape Architects, and I am thinking about the Norwegian situation with 350 something municipalities around the country, and a lot of them is big in area but small in population, maybe just a couple of thousand in population, but they have, as we have already talked about, a lot of responsibility for land use. So I'm also kind of concerned about making a system in Norway that's going to work to protect biodiversity when there is not enough competence maybe on planning, spatial planning and architecture. And I'm also a bit worried what you're saying, Sophus, that it takes so much time. We don't have so much time. So I'm also hoping that we can learn from the other countries and implement much faster in Norway. But how can you see that we can implement a good working, functioning system with this system we have in Norway with so many small municipalities?
Thank you, Line Oma. Well, just I can start with some reflections. We have made studies of how we can improve the existing system. And of course, local capacity is a huge problem. Not only in the smallest municipalities, but, you know, as we all know, local politicians in Norway are not professional politicians. They do have their primary affiliation and occupation elsewhere. So they have also the decision makers are limited in capacity. So we need to actually, we need more studies. We need to know more about how we can efficiently provide overview and visual information that is meaningful for the politician, for the political capacity. We need to know more about how we can offer information and knowledge that is usable for the local politician. That is the key. And nature accounting could be such a tool, I think. Also, we have made studies. We have the counties in Norway, we have the regional level, and they are supposed to guide and also coordinate municipal planning. This is a underused source. And also the generalist municipal commission pointed at the need to strengthen the role of the counties, the regional level, and how they guide the municipalities. A lot can be done there, also by using nature accounting as a tool to enhance and detail out knowledge and to target knowledge in a more specific manner than has been done before. Ulrika and Christian, do you have any other reflections?
Well, some first preliminary thoughts is that I think you all are well aware of, is that the situation we have today, where consultants are in part commissioned and paid by developers to evaluate projects in environmental impact assessment, is a huge conflict of interest problem, and at least it has potential to be in many cases. So, and as I saw someone in the chat mention, the propensity to give dispensations from current plans is also a huge problem. So these are stemming from, I think, the political economy of the problem, but we also have issues with the governance system in itself, and those problems, I think, can be partly solved by, as I was talking about earlier, the increased attention of the problem, as the Norwegian national broadcaster has contributed to raising in a very, very good way. And when this continues with the increased attention, when we in the future will see what nature we are losing, I think things are happening at the moment. I think the governance systems will be updated accordingly. And I really hope it won't take 38 years until we get there. But yeah, it's a huge challenge.
Christian, you actually have one more question here in the chat. Could you elaborate a bit more about the various characteristics of the municipalities with a high level of land consumption or low level of land consumption? Do they have anything in common? Industry, employment profile, age structure, etc. Thank you.
I think, well, the primary cause of these planned development areas, and I just want to make that very clear, that I have been looking at the planned development into the future, what is adopted in the plans and not what has happened recently. But a major characteristic is the issue that the primary category of planned land use is the cabins, the secondary homes, which is specifically the Norwegian problem. I think we don't have that problem elsewhere in Europe, not at least in this, not in the same scale. So what we call the cabin municipalities are some of the major causes of these huge land reserves, and we have you would think that some pressure areas where we get larger industrial projects could be an issue as well, but I think our preliminary analysis just pointed to political capacity or system capacity being one of the major drivers, local system capacity, and electoral dynamics, of course. But it's a good question, and we need to follow it up in the future.
Mm. And Ulrika, I would like to ask you as well. I think that hearing Sophus talking about the avoidance effects was interesting. And do you have any reflections though on how we can strengthen avoidance in the Norwegian system?
Yes, I've actually worked on some of my colleagues at NINA that worked on a report for the hydropower sector, which suggests that looking into the mitigation hierarchy, that avoidance and no net loss should come at a level before avoidance at all, so that you account for, you should avoid intervening at all to avoid a net loss, basically. So yeah, I don't know, avoidance is a very complex I think it's a very complex challenge, basically, because there are so many sectorial differences in how you allow, like dispensation for allowing intervention at all. And as I mentioned that, or you have to correct me on this, Sophus, but that in protected areas, in England you are not allowed to do any intervention at all, while in Norway we do allow for that to happen. So that can be challenging in the long run. Like, for example, with establishing a protected area as a compensating measure, that doesn't really ensure a protection or enhancement of net gain when you already allow intervention in a protected area. So that, yeah, there's some challenges with that, but I think we should look into reconsidering how we're thinking about the mitigation hierarchy in that sense.
Yes, and not least because the also the national level here in Norway is rather sectorized into different national authorities. They need to be better coordinated and offer perhaps clearer objectives and signals from above. There is a question for you, Sophus. Could you mention other no-net loss systems that you think function better than the BNG when it comes to mandatory offsetting? For instance, do you have any knowledge about what is going on in Germany? And do you think the BNG system could function better in terms of higher biodiversity if the offset had to be made off-site by nature restoration, not by protection?
Yeah, good. Okay, so we got a paper coming out next week in Nature Ecology Evolution called 5 Rules for Scientifically Credible Nature Markets. So in that, we summarize evidence from all the nature markets that have, for which sort of causal impact evaluations have been conducted. So we actually know how they've performed. And in that analysis, we include the International Voluntary Carbon Market, US wetland mitigation, US species conservation banks, Californian carbon market, biodiversity net gain, Australian nature-based carbon market, Victorian offset market. So that's all the ones where we know basically how they performed. There's one outstanding performer, but so most of them have actually done a really bad job. The ones that are protecting existing remnant vegetation have seriously underperformed. So in, for example, in the International Voluntary Carbon Market, or RED+, the average additionality of a credit is about 20 to 25%. So that means that 75% of credits are not real. But there's a lot of complexity around that. Some people argue that even 25% of them being real is enough to justify their existence. And I also, there's a long story behind that. But the outstanding performer in the national compliance markets is the US wetland mitigation system. Right? That's got an additionality near 1. So it creates new wetlands that would not otherwise have been created. So it does something. What is the characteristics of why it's successful? Well, so firstly, it's really old. So there's just been a lot of iterative trial and error and improvement. Secondly, it's a restoration-based system. So that is useful because basically it's just really easy to tell if restorations happened. So for wetland mitigation, to show that you've done the conservation project, you literally need to have like dug a new wetland into the ground. It's really easy to tell if that thing happened. Whereas in the International Voluntary Carbon Market or the Australian offset markets, for example, a lot of the measures are around protecting existing nature. And it's really hard to tell if you're protecting something that was about to get cut down or not. And so we've developed methods for that kind of stuff now. But in the first 20 years of trying stuff, we hadn't developed those methods yet. So there was a lot of problems in those systems. So the US wetland mitigation system is good at that stuff because it's got a really easy to observe outcome, basically, and because it's old. Where the wetland mitigation system falls down is that lots of long-term studies that have gone out to sites have found that in the long run, the ecological quality of those created wetlands does not match those of natural wetlands. So they are in a poorer condition than the ones that they replaced. But it's still, I think, by a long way, the most effective nature market that there is. So it's not as good as keeping the real thing, but it is the best of the nature markets. Your second question was, how can we make BNG better? I mean, there's so much stuff that we can do to make BNG better. I also, and it's also with these nature markets questions, the real question is better than what? It's a really hard question because for some people, the fact that they don't fully do their job means that they're bad. But I would argue that probably a more sensible counterfactual is, are they better than the thing that they replaced? And net gain is definitely better than the thing that it replaced. So the thing that it replaced was not dissimilar from the Norwegian system. It was like a system that had a completely qualitative judgment of whether or not biodiversity was going up or down. That was so informalized as to make it effectively meaningless at preventing biodiversity loss. So this BNG system, I think, is a substantial improvement on that. That's my personal opinion. So even if it doesn't, it's not 100% effective, it's better than the previous system. And then we do a lot of work on like how you can optimize the outcomes of environmental policies generally. I wouldn't constrain your mind to just nature markets here. What I've come to conclude over the last 10 years is basically like, nature markets are not more or less effective than other ways of delivering conservation. So like government-sponsored payments for ecosystem services or any of these other mechanisms or agri-environment schemes, other mechanisms for incentivizing conservation. Nature markets are not better or worse. For all of these instruments, the devil is in the detail of their dynamics. So I've seen public policies that are terrible for biodiversity, and I've seen public policies that are great for biodiversity, and I've seen nature markets that are terrible for biodiversity, and I've seen nature markets that are decent for biodiversity. So there's loads of ways that you can design these systems to be better. The main lessons from the history of these impact evaluations is spatial targeting. So you make sure the stuff is invested in places where it maximizes the good it can do for the money that you have. So that's spatial targeting. The other major thing is mechanisms for ensuring that the landholders that opt into selling services wouldn't have been doing that stuff anyway. And from my reading of the literature, the best way that we've found for doing that so far is in using auctions. So that means mechanisms to get landholders to compete for contracts, rather than just handing out standardized payments to landholders, because then they don't compete and then they don't make the effort to ensure that they're delivering the best conservation for the given unit effort. So loads of lessons about how to make stuff better, and I wouldn't just restrict it to nature markets. We've learned loads from all of these conservation incentive schemes.
Thank you. Great. Now, Matthias Brynhildsen Reinar from Bodø Municipality has a question, please.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you for very interesting presentations. I'm just wondering, given the lack of legal tools we have in Norway, we have to get into a dialogue with the developers, and there's pretty massive resistance to new stricter requirements on land use. So I'm wondering what's like a good strategy for getting on the same page, and maybe what's the experience from England from developers after these requirements? Are they seeing it as useful, or are they just seeing it as economic expenses? Yeah, thanks.
Good question. How are developers behaving in England, Sophis?
Yeah, basically it's just a huge amount of variation. The net gain system happened in the first place because it was kind of developer led. So a bunch of the leading house building companies, basically after the pilots in 2010 to 2012 that didn't generate any trades, you had a bunch of local authorities who went ahead with their local implementation. And then you also had a bunch of developers who went ahead and built their own internal practices, and then kind of lobbied government to make their practices mandatory. So there was both local government case studies and developer-led case studies that provided government with the evidence that the thing could be done. So it was some of the biggest house builders in the UK very much shaped, and infrastructure companies very much shaped the development and political acceptance of biodiversity net gain, because it had some early champions who proved that it was desirable and possible, and that was a key to the political economy of it happening. Now, today, there's just massive variation. I actually just don't know what the average sentiment of developers is. I've seen the full range of developers who think that it's making the system more effective, through to developers who hate it and who campaign for its abolition. And I don't know what the kind of average effect of that is. Now, it's also really hard to tell. It is extremely hard to tell because developers just represent a lobby group that represents their own interests. And so it's also, what we don't have is any objective data on how the introduction of biodiversity net gain has affected developers' costs or the speed through which planning applications are approved. We just don't have that evidence yet.
Can I just add a comment to that? Because, well, I have experience from qualitative research, so I looked into this, especially this one case, but some of the success criteria, what the interviewees were mentioning, is that they found it really useful when, so the developer had to, there was a requirement from the Ministry of Environment, which is unusual, but it is the collaboration between the developer, local county governor, and the municipality. They were kind of required to cooperate and collaborate together. And in that way, they found it quite useful to find the different areas that could be used for different measures. And it was a bit more of a conflict reduction for them to implement stakeholders quite early on in the project. But how this can be implemented as at a legal level, I don't know, but maybe this is something that either developers or the municipalities can kind of be upfront to either offer that opportunity or to do some more innovative governance, basically.
Thank you. Excellent. I see that our time is running up. So at the end, finally now, let me just offer two comments here from the audience. One is saying that there's an opportunity in Norwegian spatial planning going forward with major focus on evaluating existing land use plans and chance to alter, dismiss those in light of recent years' policy development, also planvask. Any narrative, data, and visual tools that more easily convey the value of current biodiversity and ecosystem services will make this process more inclined to lead to less severe impact on biodiversity than is currently being planned for. Very good point. Well, let's put that in our into consideration and into our work. And also finally, there is a comment that we should have a Norwegian think tank for nature and environment. And at the end of this session, I would like to say yes. There are the Norwegian Research Council have now received several applications, I think, and it's for the future funding of centers on a sustainable land and nature use. So let's have our hopes up for that, for future think tanks and webinars and conferences on this topic. And finally, thank you very much. Huge thanks to Ulrika, Christian, and Sophus. It has been very interesting to hear the three of you, and thank you for all of you to listen to us. Okay, bye-bye.